that brings us to our guest speaker tonight, Professor Burton Folsom. I'm really pleased to have my former professor and really a mentor and a role model for me here to teach us about one of America's most prominent entrepreneurs. And this is really a story about a person who was able to use that institutional framework of free markets and entrepreneurship to accomplish a lot for himself, but not just for himself, as we'll learn, accomplish a lot for the rest of the world, and to really serve his fellow man well through the vehicle of business and entrepreneurship. Burton Folsom is a professor of history at Hillsdale College, my alma mater. He was educated at Indiana University of Nebraska, and earned his PhD in history at the University of Pittsburgh. He is a very well-known, nationally known historian and author, very prolific author of many books, some of my favorites here, including The Myth of the Robber Barons, and this is one that's germane to the subject matter tonight. And if you're an honor student enrolled in the upcoming Gilded Age seminar, this is going to be one of the core items on the reading list. Just a few of the books that I've read. Empire Builders was a story about entrepreneurs in the state of Michigan, where Hillsdale College is located. New Deal or Raw Deal, a revisionist look at FDR's economic legacy. And Bert, would you say that FDR Goes to War is kind of a sequel?
Yes, it is.
I was pleased to get a copy of this, one of the newer books, taking a new look at the effect of FDR's management of World War II. And those are just a few. There's many more. Prolific output of scholarship that integrates the ideas of free markets and entrepreneurship and tells really compelling stories drawn from some of the great episodes in American history. But I could go on and on talking about his scholarship, but let me just tell you why I think he's such a great teacher and great person. From my own personal experience as a student of Professor Folsom, I can tell you that you will not find a more positive, cheerful, optimistic, uplifting, happy, this good-natured person. And it's such a joy to learn from a person with these attributes. And he will pull you into the story and get you interested and make you want to learn more. These books are page-turners. History books that are page-turners because it's about these really compelling stories, and he goes to great lengths to tell them in very interesting and detailed and compelling ways. So he's been a real inspiration to me both in my learning and my interest in history and in my teaching. I try to emulate him. And if you are one of my students and you are thinking right now, well, you're not cheerful, positive, optimistic, and whatnot, the fault is all mine, okay? That fault is all mine. But this is a man I'm trying to emulate. Really a hero and inspiration for me. And so let me stop talking and yield the floor to Burton Folsom.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good to be here with my former student, Dr. Watts. He was there in my first class that I taught at Hillsdale College. And I was seeing some people looking over the books. If you take the class on the Gilded Age with Dr. Watts and Dr. Hoover, it's the thin book they're using. I saw someone looking like that. Not the thick book. The thin one is the one they're using. So that could make it an attractive feature. Listen, I'm talking about John D. Rockefeller today. And what business was he in? Does anybody know? Oil, yeah. The title is Baptists in Business. He was a Baptist. He was a businessman. He was in the oil industry. Does anybody know the name of the company he was head of? I heard somebody say Standard Oil. Okay. Yeah, Standard Oil. And so here you have, he was the CEO of a company, Standard Oil. And some of you may have preconceptions about Rockefeller because he's talked about in textbooks and sometimes in other places that you might hear about it. How many let me just ask you this, if you have heard positive or negative on Rockefeller. How many have, and maybe some of you haven't heard anything at all, so you don't have to answer that. How many have heard, your knowledge of Rockefeller is he's negative? a negative view of John D. Rockefeller? A few, several, okay. How many positive views? Wow, a couple, a couple. And I take it the rest of you, well, that's why you're here, right? Who is this guy? Well, now that raises an interesting question. Who is this guy? Now, what's interesting, you look at who he was, just a general piece of information on who is this Rockefeller person. His company, Standard Oil, was very successful. By that I mean he had a market share of 70%. His one company of 70% in the late 1800s, 70% of all the oil refined in the world. Right? You talk about energy independence. One American company headed by John D. Rockefeller had a 70% market share of all the oil sold in the world. I guess after saying that, I don't have to say he was a very wealthy man. He was the first billionaire in U.S. history. And according to Investors Business Daily and Forbes magazine both, the amount of wealth he held, if you control it today for inflation, is greater than anyone else in American history. You hear about the upper 1%? The one. The upper one. Of all the hundreds of millions of Americans who have ever lived, he is the wealthiest. Now, what makes that also interesting is that, because remember the title is Baptists in Business. He was a tither. How would you like to be the church receiving his tithe? He was not only a tither, he was a great giver. So much so that by the time he died, if you look at the distribution of money that he gave away, and you look at the amount that he held, the wealthiest person in the United States was John D. Rockefeller, and in second place was the money he gave away. He gave away more money to charities than any American had previously possessed. You're talking about a superstar entrepreneur. In fact, what's going on here? I'm in Texas, the greatest oil state in the Union. I'm in a Baptist university, and I ask how many know about John D. Rockefeller, and only a handful know about this guy. And more than half the people who did know about him are negative on it. I think I have some work to do today. Some explaining. Who is this guy? His wealth was so great at its peak that he had the ability, had he done so, to pay off completely the U.S. national debt. Right? It's $18 trillion today. In the 1890s, he had the capacity and the wealth to pay off the entire U.S. national debt. You're speaking about someone who is absolutely a phenomenal entrepreneur. And it raises a question, okay, where's this guy coming from? How did he do what he did? What was he like? I want to talk about those things. In particular, you say, well, what about his background? Well, maybe his father was a pastor, you might think, or a Christian businessman himself. He may have come from a great background and had a good education, perhaps. It was before East Texas Baptist University had begun, so he couldn't have come here, but maybe he had a good education somewhere. If you look at his background, he never went to college. Had virtually no schooling, a little bit. His father, no evidence that his father was a Christian at all. His father was a peddler who went through upstate New York selling quack medicines in one community after the other. He would sell it to someone and say, hey, this will grow hair and you'll have tremendous hair. And then, of course, they would still be bald, and then they'd skip over to the next town. He was a dishonest person selling different kinds of elixirs around from community to community. The family was on the move. He was a bigamist. He married another woman and went off and lived with her much of the time. He would occasionally come back and be in John D's life. So what you have is that is his background. That is the family background of the person who became the wealthiest person in U.S. history, which suggests that inheritance is not everything. That you can overcome a bad start. His mother was a Christian. Of course, the father is out of his life, because remember, he's a bigamist and he's off with another family. And so his mother did most of the raising. She was a strong Christian. And I think in part when he became born again, he was thinking, God is the father that I kind of miss having. That God is my real father. And he was determined to be loyal to God. He read the Bible regularly. He had prayer and devotion every day. And was somewhat of a student of the Bible and wanted to put into practice what he was learning. And his mother was working with him on this. And he said, I think that there are principles in the Bible, that God is teaching us principles of how to live. And one of the principles is that we have to put God first. We have to honor God, put him first in our life. But he said also it's clear our family is important too. And I know he missed having his father around regularly. So the family was very important to him. When he would be asked in his later years what was important to him, he'd say that God was first in his life. And he said, after that, the best thing I ever did was make Jesus my Savior. The second best thing that I ever did was make Laura Spellman my wife. He was a devoted father. Spent lots of time with his children. And this is kind of odd, isn't it? Because his career was third. He loved business. But it raises the question, doesn't it? How can somebody put business, his career, third, and end up the wealthiest person in U.S. history? To Rockefeller, it wasn't that surprising because you're putting principles, you're ordering your life along biblical principles. Not necessarily that he said, well, therefore I'll be the wealthiest person. He never was thinking that. Although he did put into practice Luke 6:38, give and it shall be given unto you. And he read carefully the parable of the talents. He was fascinated by that. Right? Because the work was emphasized. You go out and work and the Lord rewards you for your work. In fact, the man with the most talents ended up getting the talent of the person who didn't do any work. You know, that was interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's in the book of Matthew. That's a little bit to the left of 2 Corinthians, to quote another businessman. But John D. Rockefeller was very anxious to follow biblical precepts. And in his life, he said, well, okay, you get these things started, and we've got God first, family second, career third. He gave lots of family time. And so he said, now how do we go into business? How do we conduct business? And he saw work as important because not only work is a chance to produce products that people can use and make life easier for them, but also work is a chance to be an administrator over a staff and then be able to influence people in a Christian way in their jobs. So it's a double thing. You have a product that people want. You want to serve people because, again, the principle is those who serve are rewarded the most, Jesus says. Well, serving people by selling somebody something that millions of people want and want to have is good service. he ended up going into the oil business, and this is before gasoline and the automobile. The oil that was pumped out of the ground was primarily, somebody know what it was used for? What Rockefeller used it for?
Kerosene.
Absolutely, kerosene. This is before electricity. So kerosene was an illuminant or a lighting, was its primary use in the 1800s. Gasoline, of course, as we move into the 1900s. So Rockefeller says, now you say, okay, well, how did he do this refining? He founded Standard Oil, and his success can be described actually fairly simply. Oil, kerosene was about $1 a gallon when he went into business. Now that sounds like a good price to us, doesn't it? But we have to factor in inflation and where that put it back in 1870, 1880. $1 would be more like $20 a gallon. Now it doesn't sound like so much fun, does it? $20 a gallon was a prohibitive price, and people used whale oil. Of course, we were running out of whales because we were capturing whales and using that for whale oil to light our homes, and it was expensive. At $20 a gallon, people could not afford to light their home very much. Too expensive. Over a period of about 15 to 20 years, he cut the price of kerosene from $1 a gallon to 8 cents a gallon. He made it cheaper than that, but he sold it at 8 cents. That's more like $1.60 or thereabouts a gallon. Now that's putting it more in the range. The difference between selling oil at today's prices at $20 a gallon and $1.60 is the difference between having a market and not having a market. Once he got that price down, then people could afford to light their homes, and it was transformative. By the way, it's kind of funny. Rockefeller saved the whales. Right? Yeah, the whales were delighted. All of a sudden, we're going to be pumping oil out of the ground and not trying to harpoon them. And so you have this new thing coming out of the ground that can be used. We were able to light our homes for a penny an hour. And all of a sudden, you had a nightlife like this. You could have people going to school at night, night activities. It opened up opportunities for many, many Americans. And so he had in other words, what I'm saying is he had a product that millions of people wanted. And so the question is, okay, $1 is what people were charging right after the Civil War in the 1860s. He comes into business in the 1870s, and he eventually gets the price down to 8 cents. How did he do it? Because that's where he goes from having no market share to 2/3 of all the oil being refined in the world. Well, he had different strategies. The first thing, above all, that he said was, he spoke very kind of softly, by the way. So he would say, well, they get a barrel of oil. Not all of it was usable for kerosene. You refined it, and about half of it could be used as kerosene, and then the other half they didn't know what to do with, so they dump it in the river. It was sludge. Well, who knows what to do with it? Dump it, and then sell the kerosene. Rockefeller approached that. First thing he said was, well, again, he was soft-spoken. God made oil. God made it. I mean, it's true. Maybe it under there and pressurized and all that, but this is all something that God was involved with. God doesn't make junk. People have purpose. I have purpose, he would say. Therefore, the stuff that people are throwing away has purpose. But we haven't found it yet. Rockefeller was instrumental in the corporate world of research and development. What we call R&D, and we take for granted that every major corporation has some kind of R&D. This was new at the time. The idea that you bring in oil into a laboratory and have chemists go through it and figure out what do you do with these byproducts. And Rockefeller would sit down with his chemists and give them a pep talk. And he'd say, now I know that this stuff that people are throwing away Now, they're using part of it as kerosene, and they're throwing part of it away. We're just going to keep this around because God has a purpose for it. And I want you to find out what it is. And so what we have here are byproducts of the oil. And his chemists discovered all of these uses for this sludge that people were throwing away. For example, naphtha or tars for paving materials. It was a byproduct that people were throwing away. Vaseline, lubricating oils, paint. There were dozens of byproducts that could be made from this stuff people were throwing away. So Rockefeller, in other words, said, well, he'd address the other oil producers. Don't bother throwing that into the Cuyahoga River here in Cleveland. Just drop it. I'll send my people by and pick it up. So they'd say, oh, okay. And so Rockefeller would take their sludge, make something of it, manufacture it, sell it profitably. I guess that makes him the first environmentalist. He saved the whales, protected the environment, which, by the way, was great because you'd get this sludge out there and there'd be people smoking a cigarette. You know, a little sludge here, throw the cigarette, boom! The oil field would explode, absolutely. And Rockefeller that was diminished because once people saw what he was doing with the sludge, it was, wait a minute, this guy's making a fortune on stuff worth throwing away. Rockefeller then turned his attention, after the byproducts, he turned his attention to the kerosene. He said, my competitors get about half of this barrel of oil and they make kerosene and they throw the other half away. Okay. Well, let's take the half that they're using. He said, maybe we can get more kerosene out of a barrel of oil. And so his research and development chemists practiced putting intense heat onto a barrel of oil and discovered through a process that was called cracking that they could actually generate more kerosene out of a barrel of oil. So in other words, what you have here, you get a barrel of oil, the average oil producer and refiner was getting maybe half of it into kerosene and throwing half away. Rockefeller's getting 2/3 of the barrel into kerosene and then making something out of the other third, plus he's getting the other people's sludge that they're throwing away. So I don't think it's too surprising that he begins to move up and quickly become the greatest oil producer in the United States and then the world. And he's always concerned. Rockefeller spent a whole day one time concerned with the oil, the drops of solder on a can of oil, because he said, well, you know, he spent his whole day trying to cut the drops of solder on one of the Standard Oil cans from 40 drops to 39. Now here you got, to the average person, you're sitting there, you mean this guy's a billionaire? Yes. And he's spending his whole day trying to figure out how to reduce the drops of solder on a can of oil from 40 to 39. Yes. Because if you produce 700,000 cans of oil every month, and you save 1 drop of solder, that's 700 drops of solder every month, and it reduces your cost. You sell it cheaper. People have cheaper oil. Their lives are improved. That was John D. Rockefeller. Now, I know you might think, wow, that guy really found the answer. He did. But there are always challenges. For example, you might think, well, he's got it made. Well, first of all, that was pretty good right there. If the story ended here, it's pretty good. But it goes further because the Russians got into the oil business. We all know the Middle East is loaded with oil. Russia is touching the Middle East. It was right there, right north of Iran, the Baku oil fields. They drilled, got these gushers, and began selling it on the international market. He has a tough competitor. And that was highly viscous, high-quality oil they were selling on the world market. So Rockefeller all of a sudden has tremendous foreign competition. The second thing that happened is the oil fields in Pennsylvania dried up. That's where the original oil fields were in Pennsylvania. Dry up. And so then the question is there oil anywhere else? Well, I see some smiles around the room. Some of you may know somewhere west of Pennsylvania where there might be some oil. Well, actually, Rockefeller, he wasn't perfect. He overlooked Texas. Because the U.S. government issued a geological report that there was no oil in Texas. He believed it. And so he didn't really investigate Texas. But we did have oil discoveries in Ohio, at Lima, Ohio. Problem. It was high sulfur oil. Now, some of you may be familiar with some of it. Does anybody experience or know about high sulfur oil? What it smells like? What's it smell? Somebody said rotten eggs. I smelled it. That was the first thing I thought. This smells just like a rotten egg. I think, having said that, you can understand the problem that people might have putting the new Lima oil in their kerosene lamp in their living room. In other words, we have the oil, but it's high sulfur and we can't really use it. And the Russians are out there. And people wrote articles. People started, even his own officers, some of them started selling stock in the company. They said, well, companies have their growth period. They go up and then they go down. And now we're ready to go down and we're going to be ready to move on to another investment. Rockefeller wasn't ready to give up that quickly. Rockefeller said, I like research and development. I'm going to have my chemists work on that high sulfur oil to see what they can do with it. And so Rockefeller began buying up the oil in Lima, Ohio. Millions of dollars. In today's money, it would be hundreds of millions of dollars. Money that the company was spending, putting into tankers in reserve, this stinky oil that they couldn't sell. Now that hurts your bottom line. You can't sell it right away. It's in storage. You're losing money, and the Russians are out there competing, taking your foreign markets. His board of directors got so upset and said, well, I just don't think, Mr. Rockefeller, you ought to be doing this. But they found that he couldn't. Rockefeller was so charming and lovable, and people who liked working for him. He had one person who was so good in West Virginia, he brought in the oil and sold it throughout the state. Rockefeller said, now, Mr. Simmons, I want you to take off maybe 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and just relax. You've done such good work for us. And he took off for a while. He said, I don't want to miss going to work for Rockefeller. It's so fun to please him. I want to get back in the game. He was even trying to give the guy a vacation. His staff respected him. And so the board got together. Because Rockefeller, every month when they'd have the board meeting, Rockefeller would say, let's buy some more Lima oil. I'm sure our chemists will get this figured out. No. Finally, they said, the only way we can resist Mr. Rockefeller is if all of us agree to say no in advance. And the whole board got together a couple hours ahead of the meeting, and they all started talking. They said, we know the boss is going to want to do this oil. Let's all agree to say no. And no matter what kind of charming talk he gives us, let's say no. Do we all agree? Just say no. And so they all agreed. Yeah, no, we're not going to do it. And they knew his strategy. He would always go around at a board meeting, and when he had an issue that was controversial, he would go around the room and get everybody's opinion before he said what he thought. Because Rockefeller wanted honest opinions. He thought, if I tell everybody what I think, it may have people say, oh, well, I agree with you. He thought, let's hear what they think. That was the way he approached it. And they knew that. And so he went around the room and he said, well, they went through the agenda. Next on our agenda is the high sulfur oil. And so Rockefeller says, well, what do you all think? And so they go around the room and every single one says no. No, no. And finally, after 15 no's, I talk about this in The Myth of the Robber Barons, my book. I quote him. He said, well, very well, gentlemen. At my own personal risk, I will put up the money to care for this oil. $2 million, $3 million if necessary. In other words, you unanimously say not to buy it. I respect you people as colleagues. Okay. I'll buy it myself in stores with my own money. And they thought, oh my gosh, the boss could go broke. We can't have this. And Rockefeller described what happened. He said, this ended the discussion, and we carried the board with us because they couldn't bear to see him risk his own money completely. And they continued to use the funds of the company in what was regarded as a very hazardous investment of money. But we persevered, and 2 or 3 of our practical scientific men stood firmly with me and constantly occupied themselves with the chemists, until at last, after millions of dollars had been expended in tankage and buying the oil and constructing pipelines and tank cars to draw it away to the markets where we could sell it for fuel, one of our German chemists cried, "Eureka! We have found a way to clear up the oil." And now Rockefeller had bought all that cheap oil, was loaded with it, and was ready to take on the Russians, and ready to continue selling the cheapest oil in the world. We're dealing here with a person willing to take risk, willing to have faith. Faith in his staff, that God didn't create junk, and the result, Standard Oil rising at the top. Let me say just a couple things, concluding remarks, because I thought it might be good to give you some insight a little bit into the company. First of all, how many have heard this thing that Rockefeller or somebody, when you sell and you're the best one, you know, what's called predatory price cutting. You can cut the price and then knock everybody out. People asked Rockefeller if he ever did that. After he'd retired, he said, no, I didn't do that because it's a money loser to do that. He said, why is that a money loser? He says, because I have 70% of the oil market in the world, so if I go down and cut my price to get the other 30, I just lost money that I could have had with the other 70 that were already buying from me, and now I can't make profits on them anymore just to get the 30. And even if I did have 100%, then when I raise the price back up, they just come back in. That's stupid. I guess my point is he really thought that was a bad strategy, what's called predatory price cutting. In his company, I wanted to just explain, he trusted his subordinates and they would appoint people to key offices. It was always an honor to be appointed to work at the Standard Oil building in New York. One story that was told by Alan Nevins, he won a Pulitzer Prize, wrote a biography of John D. Rockefeller in 1940. Rockefeller almost lived to be 100 years old. He was in his late 90s. He died in 1937. And Alan Nevins went around and was interviewing people who knew Rockefeller. All his children said, oh, he was wonderful. He taught us how to ride bikes. He taught us how to ice skate. One time he went to work with a black eye because he ran into the table playing blind man's bluff with a blindfold on trying to catch us. And they all had these vivid memories of their dad. And the other one that came forth was this person who had been appointed to, he'd been a really good oil salesman, and he got appointed to the top floor where the executives were in the Standard Oil building in New York. And he said, I went up there. He says, I told everybody, I'm going to New York to work for Standard Oil, the top floor. And they all were really impressed. That's where I'm going. I leave tomorrow, everybody. And so he went to the top floor where he'd been allowed to have his office. He came in, went to the secretary, gave his name. Here I am. Where's my office? I'm ready to go. And she looked down the list a second. We don't have your office ready yet. It may be a couple weeks. Now, when you've told everybody that you are hot stuff and are going to be on the top floor, you don't want to be sitting there going down and say, well, they don't have my office ready yet. That's not exactly high authority. And so he thought, is there some way I can make do? And he looked around and thought, well, all the officers, oh, by the way, he was impressed. H. Rogers, he was one of the big executives. There's his office. Look at that thing. Like, John Archibald. These were all the big leaders, the executives. These are the people I'm now working with. And so he was going down and he saw this room that was an exercise room, it looked like. There's some guy in there doing some exercise machine. And he thought, there's a chair. And, he got the idea. I know what. I'll get the chair. I'll go in the exercise room. We'll move out all that equipment. I'll get the secretary to bring me in a table. And this will be my makeshift office for the next 2 weeks. So that I'll tell everybody I'm still up here. So he went in and got the guy said, now, you'll have to leave here. I'm going to be using this as my office. So the guy left. And then he's in there, okay. Got his chair, and he was working. And then he went back to the secretary and said, I need a table because I'm using as an office that room around there. And she looked around, which room? Said, well, that room. You mean, well, that's Mr. Rockefeller's exercise room. Did he tell you you could use that? In literature, they call it the epiphany. That moment of awareness. Wait. Who's that guy kicked out of the room? And suddenly, that face looks familiar. And he realized the moment of awareness, his first day, he had been up there less than an hour, and he had kicked John D. Rockefeller out of the room. And he said he went back into the room. He crawled back. Got in there and slumped over the chair and waited to be fired and sent on his way. He was never fired. Nothing ever happened. In fact, he ended up getting, eventually, his office there. And when Alan Evans was interviewing, he said, did you ever mention this to Mr. Rockefeller? No, I did not. It raises an interesting question, doesn't it? John D. Rockefeller's sitting there using his exercise machine up there on the top floor, and some whippersnapper comes in there and kicks him out of his room. You think, well, why didn't he get upset? And we don't know, because that guy, again, never asked Rockefeller why. But if you look at Rockefeller, it makes perfect sense. Rockefeller's a team player. He says, no, what's going through his mind? First of all, the guy didn't know what he was doing. He didn't realize who I was. So it was an accident. Point number 2, nobody gets appointed to this floor for an office unless he's made millions of dollars for the company doing something. My subordinates who make these decisions, that is a part of what they're all about. Therefore, this guy who's made millions of dollars for my company, of which I'm a major stockholder, made an honest mistake. It's okay. But what this did, this is part of a picture. He had very few strikes. A labor unrest in his fact. He paid good wages. He had tremendous relationships with his people under him. And he headed a company that made a difference. If you look at the Gilded Age, the late 1800s, the rise of the United States being a world economic power, we're second rate next to England and Germany in the 1860s. We're first rate by the end of the century. It starts with John D. Rockefeller. It starts with our first billionaire. It starts with the guy who dominates the oil industry so that all foreigners practically are buying from us. And then when Henry Ford comes along and becomes the second billionaire in U.S. history, he's working with the oil that is the best in the world, produced, can be transformed into gasoline. He's working with the best steel because our steel industry also grew under Andrew Carnegie in the late 1800s. The American dominance of the 1800s, sparked by Rockefeller, followed up in the 20th century by Henry Ford and the automobile, gave birth to the American century and gave us the kind of prosperity which we still enjoy today. America's first billionaire. Tither and Christian, giving money to schools, giving money to missionaries all over the world, giving away the equivalent of $20 billion today to missions and Christian causes and other kinds of causes. That was the life of John D. Rockefeller, a remarkable entrepreneur. Thank you. Why don't we have some questions? I wish we could get Mr. Rockefeller back from the dead to answer them, but I'll try. Yes, sir.
Why have they heard so many, like, a lot of the people that know Rockefeller, have they heard bad things?
Yeah, well, maybe we could ask them. I don't know, what have some of you heard about Rockefeller that might be negative? Anybody? I want to say this, historians don't treat him well. I love one of the best-selling American history textbooks. Some of you may have had it in high school or college, The American Pageant, by Kennedy and Bailey. Yeah, they're very negative toward Rockefeller. He says, Rockefeller would sit down looking at his competitors. He claimed to be a Christian. Therefore, he sat down as he approached his competitors and said, let us pray. P-R-E-Y. Historians, or academics, I should probably say, generally, do not respect entrepreneurs very much. They're often two different breeds. Rockefeller never went to college. I mean, Cornelius Vanderbilt never went to college. Look at the modern ones. Steve Jobs didn't finish. Bill Gates didn't finish. One of my best entrepreneurial students at Hillsdale College, he was a good student, but he wanted to be an entrepreneur. And I thought, boy, he has potential to be a graduate student, all that. I talked with him. He said, I can't wait to get out of here and go to business. An entrepreneur looks at college as 4 years of wasted time. That I could be dominating the oil industry or something. The mind of an entrepreneur is, how can I make something and that people want? In the case of Steve Jobs, right? He knew I wanted this before I did. He knew I wanted this before I knew I wanted it. Rockefeller, I guess, in a sense, was the same way. People didn't sit around and say, boy, I want to have night school at 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock. He just knew if he gave people light at night through cheap oil, that people would find uses for it. An entrepreneur is excited to use money to generate products and make a difference. You make a difference. So what difference do we make in your life? An entrepreneur says, I give them something that they wouldn't ordinarily have, and it saves them money, it makes them happy. An academic is not usually risk-oriented. We like tenure. Tenure is fun. To an entrepreneur, producing a product is fun. You've got, in fact, it's fun. Listen, you know, not so at Hillsdale. It's a good school, but where I taught at other schools, these entrepreneurs. So they never even been to college, and they're out there. This guy's selling underwear as a millionaire. He's a millionaire selling underwear, and I'm making a lowly salary as a college professor. It's not fair. I ought to be the one making the decisions. It's very hard for entrepreneurs to get good treatment from writers, textbook people, academics, historians, and so on, because they're just two different mindsets. Also, the entrepreneurs don't leave a lot of records around because they're too busy doing things. Historians like people who write diaries and have all sorts of things. Rockefeller, he didn't have an autobiography, but there's not a lot that is there to work with often. Thus, there tends to be a tension between the academics and the entrepreneurs, and they often don't get a fair shake in the college classroom. But I have to admit, I was surprised a little bit that here you've got a guy who just loved the Baptist church. Although he said, I'm a Christian. I mean, I don't want to just identify with a denomination. I want to do what the Bible says, but I like the Baptist community and I want to be part of it. It's interesting, even within that niche, I'm a little surprised that he hasn't received more attention than that. It's just interesting. But hey, this is for movie. Anybody ready to produce a good movie? Christian going into the culture and competing as a Christian. There's a guy to write a movie on. Very interesting. Change the way people think about Christians, change the way people think about entrepreneurs. There is something that's a possible project maybe for someone to hear. Yes, sir.
So that kind of coincides with today's academic view, vilification of capitalism.
Yes.
But what about back in that day? I mean, was he viewed as, an outstanding philanthropist?
Mixed.
Yeah.
Mixed. The journalistic world tended to be negative. Ida Tarbell wrote a book against him called History of Standard Oil. She was upset because her father was in the oil business. He sold oil at 10 cents a gallon, and Rockefeller sold it at 8. And people did not buy her father's oil. And a scathing book was written on Rockefeller. So he had his detractors back then, but he had people who absolutely thought he was marvelous. He had both of them back then. He had the critics. Most of all, because he was so wealthy, he had people who wanted to hit him up for money. Rockefeller said, whenever somebody invites me for a golf game, because he was not a very good player, but he enjoyed the golf. It was good relaxation. He'd say, sometimes it's the 14th hole, sometimes the 15th hole. But I always then hear about the great cause that I need to contribute to from my golfing partners. He got so he could hardly walk down the street without people trying to get money from him. I think of him sometimes because I know some of you are thinking, wow, that's a problem I'll take. I have to admit that I sort of agree with you. But I just want you, he had this house in Florida, and he had a screened-in porch, and he talked. He wrote about this. He says, I couldn't go out because everybody would have come up and asked me for something. So I'd be behind the screened-in porch, I'd watch the people go by, and I'd wonder what kind of work they do, or if that was a happy family. In other words, he enjoyed people, but because of his great wealth, it was hard for him to be around them. He liked to spend sometimes times with children. He would, because the children wouldn't know who he was. So he'd talk with the children, and they'd slide down the slide and all of that. And it's an interesting situation that he was in to be that wealthy. So the answer is it's mixed. He had his critics, but he had people who loved him. And he had to be isolated because so many people wanted something from him.
Where did he get his startup capital from?
Where did he get his startup capital from? Because he wasn't, he didn't have much from his background. He served as an accountant for a merchant. He was described as this, the beauty of Rockefeller is he had the mind of an accountant, that he was as a bookkeeper. He could see the flow of money. At the same time, he had a vision for what could be accomplished with oil. Usually, most of us tend to be one or the other. We're either a detail person or an idea person. And Rockefeller had abilities in both areas. And so he earned some money, and then he got other Christians from the Erie Street Baptist Church and other fellow Christians to join with him to start up on a small scale to start Standard Oil, and then implement the ideas that eventually allowed him to get bigger and bigger, to buy out other companies and get to be the largest.
Maybe one more question.
Sure.
report that he profited off the stock market crash?
Well, remember this. He's born in 1939. Now that's worth thinking about. So that makes him 90. So I mean, that was he retired from Standard Oil in about 1901, 1902. So that was 27 years later. He had given away most of his fortune by then, and he had most of the rest of it in trust funds. He didn't get clobbered in the stock market, but he was pretty much out of investing very much at that point in his life. You know, I wish I could say he did profit off that, because that's exciting to be able to say 90-year-old entrepreneur figures that out too. He did okay. He didn't get clobbered.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Folsom.
Hey. Yeah.